So we're recording now for those students who really wanted to be here. But for those of you who've never read this book before, I'm just going to give you a really quick introduction to what it's about, like 1 minute, and then I'm going to turn the floor over to our panel. So the argument of Isabel Wilkerson in this book is that slavery ended in 1865 in the US, but the structure of caste remained intact, not only surviving slavery, but actually hardening and calcifying in American culture. And very famous, or very interestingly, she says that India and the US are the oldest and largest democracies in human history, with caste systems that, quote, undergirded them, these countries, by their reading of the sacred texts of their respective cultures. The 4 professors on this panel have examined particularly part 3 of this book, where Wilkerson talks about the different sort of pillars of caste. She talks about divine will and heritability and fixed nature and the control of marriage and mating and purity and pollution and dehumanization and stigma and terror as enforcement. And so those are particularly the things that the professors are going to talk about from their respective subject areas. So we'll have them each present to us for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open the floor up for discussion and questions. Okay, so without further ado, Professor SenGupta.
Thank you, Professor Mancia. And thank you to our wonderful colleagues and students for coming on a stormy, is it Monday? The days sort of run into each other, right? So let me start my remarks by sharing with you a personal anecdote. A few years ago, on a visit to New Orleans, I went on a tour of the Louisiana State Museum in the French Quarter. Now, we came to a section with musical instruments, including African drums, and an older white woman who was on the tour turns to my partner, who's the only Black person on the tour, and says, "Oh, please, won't you play those drums for us? Please, please play those drums." So my partner was a little startled. And then he explained that he was a professor of cultural theory at NYU. And while he writes about culture, he doesn't play drums. But and he was very polite about it all. And and she was really a nice woman. She just jumped to certain conclusions, shall we say, based on physiognomy. So I was reminded of this incident when I read about Isabel Wilkerson's observation about how the enslaved were forced to perform on command, right? We know, those of you who have had classes with me, we talked about how the singing, dancing, infantile, docile, Sambo stereotype was a staple of pro-slavery imagery, the imagery of the Southern plantation as a patriarchal paradise filled with benevolent masters and happy slaves, right? And this Southern plantation with its race constructs are, of course, central to the story of American caste that Isabel Wilkerson is telling in her book. And she packs a punch by suggesting that it is very similar in structure and outcomes to systems that we would consider very un-American: Indian caste and Nazi genocide of the Jews. Now, other scholars have made these analogies, although not between the covers of the same book. But 2 questions arise, and that's what I'm going to focus my comments on. First, do these analogies work from the perspective of history and lived experience? And second, what political work are these analogies doing? Because I think that's a very important part of this project as well. Now, let me start with the second question, confining my comments to the India-US analogy, because that's what I know best. Setting aside for a moment the particular histories of race and caste, we know that they're both relations of power, right? Dalits and African-American civil rights activists have long forged solidarities. And I do think that it is strategic and compelling to use the language of caste. Why? Because it conveys the stubborn persistence of systemic racism in American society. Caste implies heritability. It implies fixity of power relations. And that is how race functions in American society. It is propped up not just by law, but it is propped up by centuries-old cultural traditions and economic inequities, which is what those 8 pillars were talking about, and etiquettes of race relations and so on. And so by using the word caste, we are reminded, for instance, that changing the laws in the 1960s did not root out systemic racism. And so anti-racists cannot afford to let our guard down. Now, Wilkerson, of course, illustrates this tragic sameness, this continuity over time by drawing graphic pen pictures, those of you who have read the book, of Black Death, right? Broken Black bodies that link past with present, and by naming the victims of these lynchings. But where does this leave the second question from a professional historian's perspective? In other words, does the analogy between Indian caste and American race work as history and as lived experience? Now, let me preface my take on this by sharing with you another anecdote. First year in grad school, I was taking this course on slavery with a famous slavery historian, Eugene Genovese. He asked me to do a term paper comparing race and caste. I did. He loved the paper. But when I tried to do something more with it, scholars of India said to me, don't even try, because the histories of caste and race are so different that your paper would never pass professional peer review, right? And I would love to hear what Professor Banerjee has to say about this, but I mean, just off the top of anyone's head, the configuration between caste and class in India is intensely complex, and it has shifted over time. It's arguably incommensurable with American race. But I would argue the following, and I would love to debate this with Ben and Swapna later on. I think that there is one sense in which we can make an analogy, although somewhat differently than Wilkerson envisions. And here I'm thinking of historians like Nick Dirks, if you've read him, Castes of Mind, in which he talks about modern Indian caste as having emerged at least partly as a form of colonial knowledge production, right? So the British enumerated and classified Indians into broad categories, caste categories, much as they subsumed a variety of groups in, say, Nigeria into 3 broad groups: Igbo, Hausa, Yoruba. Now, if modern caste is partly, at least, a form of colonial knowledge production, then I think that we can say, likewise, American race was produced in the brutal crucible of slavery's capitalism, which reversed the relatively fluid social relations that had existed in the early 17th century. And so what we historians can add to Wilkerson's argument is that is frankly a discussion of the economic roots of racial caste. I think that's a crucial part of the story here. As the historian Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham has argued, right? As slavery blossomed, what happens? Race emerges as a signifier of master-slave relations. It was superimposed upon class and property relations. The enslaved were defined in law as animate chattel, meaning that they constituted property, both property as well as a social class. And they were exploited under a system which sanctioned white ownership of Black bodies as well as Black labor. Now, how did racial caste come about? We all know the beginnings of the story. Europeans colonized vast new lands in the Americas suitable for growing labor-intensive staple crops, right? Sugar, indigo, tobacco, etc. Now, historians have debated exactly why European settler colonialists solved their problem by turning to African labor as opposed to African slavery, as opposed to other things. And now the story is long, but let me see if I can abbreviate this. In the 1970s, many of you know, the historian Edmund Morgan argued that for tobacco planters in 17th century Virginia, the transition from white indentured servitude to black slavery offered both political and economic advantages, right? It created a self-reproducing labor force with no expectations of social mobility that white servants had. At the same time, it had the potential to drive a wedge between white workers and black workers along the color line and forestall interracial challenges to the social order. But other historians have pointed to larger Atlantic developments, right? Long before Bacon's Rebellion, wealthy office-holding planters were taking lessons from colonial Latin America, from the British Caribbean, and so on, and turning to African slavery because Africans had better command of skills for clearing land, for practicing forest husbandry. And then in 1698, what happens? Royal African Company loses its monopoly over the slave trade. So supply of slaves to North America increases. And frankly, enslaved black labor becomes more affordable just as fewer white indentured servants are coming to the Americas. Now, historians have also shown that planters, these European settler colonialists, they propped up violently coercive labor practices, partly as a response to pressures from below. What are we talking about? For instance, when biracial persons sired by white men filed freedom suits, colonial legislature said, wait a minute, we have to clarify that slave status derives from what? Slave status derives from the condition of enslaved Negro mothers. When enslaved people mount insurrections, how do colonial legislatures react? By passing a series of extensive police measures. And so more recently, for instance, Edward Rugemer has suggested that in South Carolina, an increasingly Africanized labor force started resisting, running away to Spanish Florida, mounting insurrections like the Stoner Rebellion. And so lawmakers reacted by stripping the enslaved of all of their rights to assemble, travel, dress above their station, keep horses, engage in commerce, acquire literacy. So slave laws initially, remember, it was all about repression. It was all about putting down slave insurrections. In 1669, a Virginia law asserted that since the obstinacy of many Negroes could only be suppressed by violent means, if a master chanced to kill a slave in the course of punishing him for resistance, the murder would not be considered felony because premeditated malice could not be presumed in a man's destruction of his own estate. Now, during the American Revolution, anti-slavery has no traction, right, in the southern colony-turned states because it is so profitable. Scholars of slavery's capitalism have shown that following its defeat in Haiti, slavery comes roaring back in Brazil, in Cuba, the southwestern United States, now cleared of Indian nations through war or treaty. Driven by the Industrial Revolution, fortified by the political clout of slaveholders, human chattel produced new commodities on a vast new scale for mass consumer markets across the world. New machinery, the genetic engineering of crops, innovations in transport and communications, improved efficiencies. The plantation became a laboratory for modern techniques of management, accounting, finance, torturous industrial labor discipline. In the US, northern bankers, merchants, shipping, insurance, land companies invested heavily in slavery and the domestic slave trade, while the cotton trade infused valuable specie into Anglo-Atlantic economies. The domestic slave trade turned enslaved Black people into not just labor, but credit and collateral while tearing their families and communities apart. Now, it is important to note, especially for current political alignments, right, that Black slavery and white freedom went hand in hand, right? As early as the 17th century, Virginia, even as slave codes were stripping Black people of their rights, free white males in the colony earned many of the rights of Englishmen, including the right to vote. So you have the beginnings then in colonial America of representative democracy for white men. You have an aristocracy of color. So what are you telling non-slave holders? You have no land, doesn't matter, because in our society, aristocracy depends not on money, but on skin color. Black slavery is what preserves your status as white men. Now, this is also accompanied by a shift in the terminology used to describe the statuses of freedom and unfreedom. In the law codes, if you can see the beginnings of this racialized language, right? So the English at first referred to themselves as Christian. Christian means, it implies free status, but anyone could convert to Christianity, right? So by 1700, the much less changeable attribute of color is coming to signify free status. And so the term Negro means two things. It connotes both skin color, blackness. It also connotes unfreedom, eternal unfreedom, while the term white came to be equated with freedom and privilege. In a bipolar society legally constructed in Black and white, free Blacks, of course, were an anomaly, right? So in the first 50 years after the institutionalization of slavery, most colonies excluded African Americans from the right to vote or hold office, muster in the militia, bear arms, employ indentured servants, and so on. And so in this way, racial caste was born in law, in language, in institutions. And let me just conclude by saying it casts a long shadow, does it not, in let's say, in current attempts by Trump to disfranchise Black voters by leveling spurious claims of voter fraud in Black majority cities. For as William Faulkner once famously noted, the past is never dead. It is not even past. And that is why the language of caste carries power for our current struggles. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor SenGupta. So we're going to pass the baton to Professor Fleming. Some of you from history might not know Professor Fleming. He teaches in the Religious Studies program, and it was his idea to have this panel. So we owe him a big round of applause just for that. But off he goes, Professor Fleming.
All right. Okay, thank you, Lauren. Yeah, and thank you, Gunja, also for that wonderful talk. I learned a lot. So this is completely outside of my comfort zone, this, from a scholarly perspective, and it's precisely why I thought it would be a good idea to try it and investigate. So I began thinking about this book last summer when I heard Isabel Wilkerson's interview on NPR over the radio, but I think not long after it was came to market. So what struck me at the time was its potential as a helpful approach to the problem of racial division in America today, which has both perplexed and horrified me as a Canadian coming to live in America relatively recently. And especially as it highlighted and gave efficacy to the essential importance of cross-cultural and disciplinary comparisons at its heart. In short, it appeared to me to be a timely book that had much to offer me as an academic of pre-modern South Asia, who often seeks expressive and meaningful ways to engage with students and to expand my thinking about American culture and ways to approach it. I had to get the book basically after hearing that interview, and was delightfully encouraged to discuss it with my students at Brooklyn College, by Lauren especially. So my overall takeaway from the book was reading it is that, and I don't mean this negatively, but was both journalistic and impressionistic to some extent. But because of that, there was a certain freedom of discourse and curiosity, as well as an exploratory spirit that I found appealing and extremely valuable as a didactic tool. It raises points of serious debate in the midst of Black Lives Matter movement we're currently experiencing in America. And so I was glad, one of the reasons this started was my union at the time was amplifying the voice of Anthea Butler, who happens to be one of my former colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania in the religion department there, who had, before Labor Day week, had advocated that scholars should strike for a couple of days, I think following the NBA strikes that have been happening in support of Black Lives Matter, and that we should refrain from teaching. I personally did not strike that day, but what I did do was use it as an opportunity to introduce my students to this book. So I basically dropped what I was going to talk about that day and brought in a sample selection of reading from this book and looked at the complexity of applying caste theory to American racial politics. So one of my questions that came out was, can caste, also known as the Varna system, be employed as a model to amplify and enrich a discussion about race in America? And what has Wilkerson done to achieve that end? So we so often as academics employ, or I have at least seen employed, political, psychological, anthropological, sociological models, et cetera, based on European theorists to shed light on social and historical problems and on human behavior in general. So is it constructive to create an analysis from South Asian cultural sources applied abstractly and out of context? And for me, it is exactly this that is the act of theoretical comparison that's so important about the book. I have seen, for instance, concepts like dharma and karma being employed in this manner. And it seems to me quite possible that such an exercise can be helpful to reflect on problems from Western culture, Western problems. In this case, race discrimination in America more thoroughly. And at the very least, it helps us to shine a different light, a different angle on a problem without necessarily relying on systems of thought that we're used to thinking about. One difference, however, with the concept like dharma and caste, one of the differences is the truly unruly and violent nature of caste. From its origins in the 10th century BCE, which is like some 3,000 years ago, to its current manifestations, it is a problematic, fraught, and chaotic term and system. It has, in one sense, always been ill-fitted to adapt to a foreign culture. So what do I mean by that? Well, theories about caste have abounded in 20th century scholarship and earlier even, especially on sacrifice and war. The very nature of the priesthood in early Vedic culture prior to 1000 BCE, which is the date upon which scholars have determined that the caste system originated, 1000 BCE. So what happened, what was it before that? If caste system was created in 1000 BC, what was there prior to that? Right, it didn't just come fully formed out of the ground. So what was the nature of the priesthood in that early period? It's uncertain. So one suggestion is that there were priestly and warrior castes that were one and the same. This hybrid warrior priest was as astute in battle as he was at performing the various offerings in hot and wet sacrifices, that is the fire sacrifice and the soma sacrifice. At least, this is the argument that John Heasterman makes in his well-known book, The Broken World of Sacrifice. The connection between ritual and violence is powerfully linked through Heasterman's argument. And accordingly, while the book itself has been criticized as being somewhat impressionistic, I think that's fine in this context. Accordingly, when we actually come to the first instance of caste creation alluded to by Wilkerson, it is through a violent act of sacrifice at the time of creation. So she draws on this myth as well at the sort of outset of her construction of the pillars of caste. This is one of the first myths that she alludes to. And that the multi-limbed Purusha, the cosmic man, is sacrificed by the gods. And it is through this hymn to the cosmic man, the Purusa Sukta, which is Rig Veda 1090, that the first manifestations of caste emerged into a field of creation, ostensibly at the beginning of time and space itself. So it is a cosmic sacrifice. The parts of the body of the cosmic man who has 1,000 arms, 1,000 legs, 1,000 heads, 1,000 eyes, etc., breathes all manner of, one might expect of a cosmic being. His lips become Brahmins, the arms, the Kshatriyas, his legs, the Vaishyas, and his feet, the Shudras. Various other parts become the various lands of the world, the animals, and so forth. So a very violent creation brings us the caste system and the universe itself. So I would then argue that violence is infused into the very fabric of the notion of caste and caste division from its outset. And in this way, it can and is powerfully employed as a lens to look upon the violence of dehumanization so vividly described in detail by the narratives and stories in Wilkerson's book. And yet, while the Vedic myth promotes this primordial violence of the cosmic sacrifice, it is, in its heart, a strategy, one that attempts to bring control and order over intersected cultures that were neither harmonious nor hybrid, but tactile and vibrant in their difference, which is to say there was a Vedic culture that came into South Asia, encountered another culture, and through that interaction, there was an attempt at control over one culture over another. And so this system was produced in order to accommodate that awkward fit, if you like. So this is to point out that caste is awkward and has always been awkward and known to fit onto South Asian culture. For example, the jati system, I believe Wilkerson herself talks to some extent about the awkward fit of caste onto jati, the system of sort of jobs that everybody has and born into a much smaller concentric set of circles onto which you fit yourself in the broader caste division of 4 or 5 castes. So it has an embedded tension, therefore, caste does, that inevitably will lead to discrimination and violence. And we know from within the culture itself, within South Asia, there are problems with the caste at that time, right? So when Wilkerson talks about this myth, she actually draws from a book 900 years later, the Law Code of Manu, which was written in the 1st century BCE. And these codes of law are emblematic of that ancient strategy in full effect, the attempt of control, but after 900 years of processing, if you like. When they first appear in the Rig Veda, that processing has not been undertaken. And so we know the resistance to these strategies through the voices of Buddhism and Jainism, and also within Hinduism itself. If you look at the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, these epic narratives, there's many stories within them, story cycles, which talk about caste discrimination and the inability of someone to traverse caste even if they are desirous to do so. So there are ancient voices also speaking out against caste in this manner. So I began to hear bits and pieces about the reception of this book after, I heard the NPR interview, and I heard, on social media and various Indological list servers. I was curious to see that a number of my colleagues largely dismissed the work as ineffective and as not being a good treatment of the topic. And I have a large list of works that have been cited and deemed more erudite and thorough treatments of caste as compared to race. Inevitably, these were treatments directly of the Indian caste system, however. And in my view, posing these in and against Wilkerson's book completely misses the opportunity to discuss the power of narrative that her book evokes. So the power of story and the juxtaposition of curated narratives from three cultures, America, Nazi Germany, and India, becomes very powerful in this sense. Sure, at times employing the Indian caste system as an allegory for American racial politics is strained and somewhat ill-fitting, but nonetheless, one can argue that the caste system has, since its inception, in my view, been ill-fitting. And it is rather the human elements of these stories and the stories focus on dehumanization that I think really sort of draw the comparison together. I was struck by the efficacy of Wilkerson's use of caste as a tool to dismantle race as a category and to use it as a model drawn out of a set of ancient religious texts for a contemporary discussion of our current political climate in America. It is, in my view, giving agency to caste and to our understanding of it in a manner that did not happen before. That is, it is a broader human problem that can, if we allow it the space, to exist outside of the time and space from the culture that first produced it. It is Wilkerson's power of narrative, narration and stories that drew me into her argument. She seeks to transform or even smash is actually a quote from later in the book, to discuss the discussion of race, to an expanded discussion of the complexities of caste. Her stories circle back through the trio of America, Germany, and India by way of example and comparison. These stories can contain excruciating and visceral sense of the effect of what she calls caste injustice or discrimination in the form of bodies burned, maimed, and dehumanized. Perception and conception, birth and status are, in her view, more determining category than what she sees as the illusion of race to some extent. Her stories weave these elements into a picture of a broad social network that is at work in America, and the effects of which we see today both residually, but also sadly in the full light of day. I therefore very much appreciate her strategy, that is employing caste as a lens of amplification through storytelling onto a system of injustice. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Fleming. Okay, we're gonna move sort of, what's the word? West, I guess, right? to Professor Stern. Take it away, Professor Stern.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen with you, and I will say from the outset that I appreciate very much being invited to speak with the esteemed panelists here, though some of you may know who take classes with me, this is not exactly the matters precisely discussed in the book or not within the scope of my scholarship, but some of the texts that are sort of referred to within this section of the book are something that the type of thing that I do explore. And so I wanted to re-examine some of these with you. So I sort of apologize because I see some of my students here who've spent a lot of their afternoon reading text with me already. So I'm sorry, Nick, and I'm sorry, Dvora, and I've been doing this all day. So you got stuck with more of the same, so you can tune out. But I thought part of what was so arresting to me about the way she presented this portion of the book was that so central in a certain way were the ways that readings of certain biblical texts were used to justify sort of the entrenchment of class, sort of caste, as it sort of overlaps with that of the possibilities of race and slavery. And so what I thought I would just do today is to take a look at some of the verses that Wilkerson describes as being sort of central to these ways of sort of projecting into the past certain views of caste and race, using these biblical verses to sort of justify a present, and to demonstrate something that probably all of us know and see in lots of different iterations, that interpretation often says a whole lot more about the interpreter than what is being interpreted. So that said, I am going to take you to a different part of the world, and even farther back than the first millennium a little bit. So I'm not trying to out millennium anyone, but I'm just saying as a form of warning, this is, so I'm going to share my screen with you and you can see lots of different, let's see if I can do this quickly so you don't have to see how many different things are open on my desktop. And we'll just do this here. So again, this is a little bit more of let's read it together than let me analyze it for you. But I think it's actually a really interesting opportunity to examine exactly why categories that we view as being somehow intrinsic to the world that we've inherited are really not. And I did originally, I was sort of asked to talk about caste and sort of the Judeo-Christian tradition, but I realized that the time allotted would absolutely not permit that, with also the examination of the text that she most cites. So I thought we'd just focus on that. And if anyone has any additional questions, I have a little bibliography if you would like to take this in other directions. But the reason why I have slides, as if I have to justify it, usually I like having some artifacts, but here it's really to give you some maps, to give you some text, and we can sort of take it together. So what I want to just sort of illustrate to you today is that even though, and one of the things I really appreciated about Wilkerson's book is that she didn't, she wasn't implying that caste was somehow justified in the Bible, but rather people's readings of the Bible sort of imposed it. So I appreciated that sort of sensitive reading of the text itself. But I just wanted you to see what these texts were and how very differently we can take them if we are viewing them from the perspectives of historians rather than as people who want to justify a caste system that's sort of, again, with sort of racially entrenched overtones. So honestly, there's no notion of caste exactly in the Hebrew Bible because categories are really different there. And first, I just want to show you some of the texts that she talks about as being sort of central to these types of interpretations that ground notions of caste and race, and also different conceptions of slavery, and then just reread this text with you from a historicizing perspective. So the text that she takes a look at is one about, and I honestly, I did not realize how widespread this was as sort of a justification for certain types of categories and practices of people, but I've since reading the book, I've realized how very pervasive it is. So in the text, Noah, who's just sort of survived that whole ark thing, right? There's the ark episode, the 2x2 episode. He's the tiller of the soil, and he was the first to plant a vineyard. But he apparently doesn't really know what vineyards can do to you if you abuse them. And so he gets drunk. And not only does he get drunk, he does something you're not really supposed to do in the biblical text, which again is very, very different from what we know of Greek cultures and civilizations. You're not supposed to be exposed to the world, okay? You're not supposed to be naked. You're not supposed to be naked in front of family members, this sort of thing. Okay, so he drinks the wine, he gets drunk, and then what happens? Okay, so here we have it in the Hebrew for those of you who care. That Ham, or Ham, as it's usually pronounced, the father of Canaan. And Ham is actually a lot of exegesis about this because it's very close to Hum, which means like brown or dark, sort of. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness and told his two brothers outside. And usually in class, I have other people read it, so sorry, you guys are stuck with me, okay? But his other two sons, Shem and Japheth, took a cloth, placed it against both their backs, and walking backward, they covered their father's nakedness. So they were trying to sort of cover him in a way that sort of respected him. Their faces were turned the other way. So if you have ever been a tour guide, and you've had to walk backwards, as I did when I was in college quite a bit, right? Sort of walking like this. It's a very dangerous thing. They do it out of respect for their father. Okay, so Noah wakes up from his wine and learns what the youngest son had done to him. And he said, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers." And he said, "Blessed be the Lord, and let Cain, the God of Shem," sorry for cutting that off in the English. It's the English at the expense of the Hebrew. "Let Canaan be a slave to them. May God enlarge Japheth and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be a slave to them." So Noah lived after the flood 350 years. So it was a bad episode, but he did fine. He lived a good long life. Now, I guess it makes sense that people would look to a text like this to say, even in the Bible, right, we have the sense that there's the bad son and his progeny are slaves to the other sons and to the progeny of the other sons, right? And so this is what Wilkerson describes. So she basically says that this story was passed down through millennia, and the stories about each of the sons and the good sons and the bad son, those are stories that are passed down. And obviously people would want to say, okay, if one son is the progenitor of the good race, we want to be part of that. We want to be part of that team, right? And she also says that as the riches from the slave trade, and this is a quote here, from Africa to the New World, poured forth to the Spaniards, to the Portuguese, to the Dutch, and lastly to the English, the biblical passage would be summoned to condemn the children of Ham, right? The misdeeds of Ham, which if you're trying to figure out exactly what he did wrong in the biblical narrative, get on board, because it's very unclear, okay? And that's why lots of interpreters supply lots of things. Like some people say, oh, he castrated his father or other unsavory things, because it's not really clear what he did, because he looked in and he saw something and he told his brothers. So they basically say, she says that they look to this story to justify the kidnap and enslavement of millions of human beings and violence against them. And I think she sort of succinctly condensed it here. Okay, so from the time of the Middle Ages, some interpreters of the New Testament, even though this is not a text of the New Testament, but I think she's implying that Christians particularly described Ham as bearing black skin and translated Noah's curse against him as a curse against the descendants of Ham. So this is the curse of Ham that you might have heard about, against all humans with dark skin, the people who the Europeans told themselves had been condemned to enslavement by God's emissary, Noah. So I actually looked at this as a really interesting opportunity to go back and revisit these texts. And I'll just reiterate that it's a good opportunity to identify the question, right? Does the narrative in Genesis that we saw a little bit of before, does it justify sort of these overlapping categories of race and caste and sort of justification of slavery, or is this something that's imposed in a later period? So this is where we're going to get to our maps. Hooray! Okay. So when we think about it, this text that again it might seem like I'm belaboring it, but this is what, this is my piece of the pie. This text that is being used, let's say in the 19th century in America, is an artifact of a time that couldn't be any more different. So this is sort of a useful map of, let's say, maybe the Bronze Age. And the text describes something that happened, I guess, in the second millennium. Some people would argue before, though many people would argue that this is not a historical text to begin with. It's used in a particular way in the biblical narrative, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So think about where the United States is. We know where it is. We know where the slave trade that we're talking about took place. But this is a very different part of the world. And the cities in which the cities people inhabited who had the concerns that they had when they redacted these texts were obviously quite different. So this was a world where people are very aware of difference. They're very aware of historical enmity. They're very aware that at any given time, somebody could sweep through and invade their country and kill their king and take all their stuff and move them to distant lands, because that's what kings and empires did. And I just want you to pay attention before we go back to some other texts, what types of cities and city-states were thriving at the time. There were many in the Levant. Certainly if we're talking about the mid-second millennium, and this is something I always talk about with my classes, that if you're talking about the Levant today and you think it's in dispute, well, guess what? It's been that way since at least the second millennium BCE. So there is nothing new under the sun. And let's be real, it was just as much about resources then as it is today. But this is still the world that we're discussing. Okay, so some of you might know something about the world, some of you might not. So if we jump to Genesis 10, we're going to read these texts with an awareness of that world, okay, from which these texts emerge. So these are the lines of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah, sons that were born to them after the flood. So they list the descendants of Japheth, okay, which are, according to these more recent readings, these are the good guys. These are the people that people always understood, at least at the time, to be associated with the Greek world, the Greek civilization on the whole. This is how the rabbis understood it too. The Kittim, for example, are from Cyprus, right? So it's that sphere of the world. From, let's see, I'm toggling screens, from these maritime nations branched. So a lot of the sea-going nations, especially around what we identify as Greece, those are associated with Japheth, okay? Now for the baddies, get ready, okay? These are the descendants of Ham, Cush, Mitzrayim, Put, and Canaan. Now Cush is, when you're talking about Cush or Put, then you'll talk about places where people have skin that is brown of varying hues, right? But Mitzrayim is Egypt. Okay, so Cush, Mitzrayim, Put, and Canaan. The descendants of Cush, Seba, we don't have to go through those, okay? I promise you're not gonna have to let me listen to that, but we can continue, okay? The mainstays of his kingdom were Babylon, Ashur, Mitzrayim, the Philistines, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Archites, the Sinites, blah, blah, blah. Okay, if you know anything about this part of the world, you know that in the Bible, none of these guys are the good guys. They're always the bad guys. They're always the enemy guys, right? And so these are the people who sweep in and destroy the 10 tribes of Israel. These are the people who come in and will destroy the temple in Jerusalem and exile its elites to Babylon. And that would be lost on you, except for the fact that even though this is a text that's describing basically the beginnings of time, it's still actually redacted in the 6th century BCE, when these realities are very current. So they're looking at a far back past, but with awareness of modern, at least 6th century modern politics. Okay, so they associate all of these sort of negative peoples who've done bad things to Israel with the descendants of Ham. Okay, so some of these guys stay bad. Some of these, the Girgashites, the Perizzites, they never really make up for lost time. Other texts are more positive about those peoples. But one of the things that you'll notice is that all of them tend to produce, the ones who are listed as the descendants of Ham are the ones who ultimately sort of either overcome Israel, destroy the North Israel when it divides into North and Judah. They're the ones who are sort of the bad guys. Again, the bad guys. Okay, and the 5 minutes is fine. So this really is like a laundry list of all the bad nations, bad, as I'm saying, from Israel's perspective, not from their perspective, not from anyone else's perspective. Here's just an image of Cyprus. So if you think about that, and we go back to that story, right? We realize that this is not so much about caste necessarily. It's sort of like, how did all these peoples come about? And why do we feud with them? And why do we not feud with the others? And why are there some who are sort of like us? And why are there other peoples who are not like us and apart? So it doesn't reflect a conception of race whatsoever. It just reflects a sense that people are where they're from. And underscoring this is the placement of this text within the biblical narrative, because it's after the discussion of the flood, which sort of like wipes clean humanity and regrows it in an improved way, theoretically. But it also precedes the story about the Tower of Babel, which is itself a discussion of how come people speak so many different languages in the world. So I would say that rather than sort of I mean, you can see whatever you want to in any text whatsoever, but I think this is a really good example of the novelty of those readings of these ancient texts, because there isn't a notion of race there, and there isn't a notion of caste there. There's a notion that different cultures grow up differently, right? People speak different languages, they worship different gods, they orient themselves politically in different ways, but this is not about something genetic, for sure. This is not about something that's sort of an intrinsic difference. These are etiologies. These are stories to explain the why, right? Why do we speak the different languages? Why did those people just come in, invade our town and destroy everything and drag us off to a city that we don't want to live in? Well, it's because their ancestors were bad and they stayed bad through all these years, right? So Jewish and Christian thinkers push these notions of difference in really different directions. And I'm happy later, if you want to explore it at all, to talk about it. But this is just more of an example or a case study of how important it is to sort of take a moment and sort of unpack some of these really entrenched interpretations, because you can see by making that jump, by looking at sort of the suppositions of people who have a lot invested in maintaining caste and maintaining slave systems and this sort of thing, and then you go back to the ancient text, you realize this is really a fabrication. It's a use of a raw material for something that's very different. So were there differences of status and class and things like this among people in ancient Israel? To be sure, but this way of looking at differences between people, and certainly differences of looking at who is a slave and who is not, those are not apparent within the text at all if you look at it from an ancient perspective. So thank you for allowing me to contribute to this conversation, and I look forward to what Swapna has to say.
All right, thank you, Professor Stern. We are now going to turn the floor over to Professor Banerjee.
Hello. Hi, thank you, Ben, and thank you, Lauren, for giving us this opportunity to engage with this huge expose on caste and race as presented by my colleagues, and who took us from the antiquity to present day US. So I am going to share my screen, and I'm going to work more as a modern historian of South Asia, because a lot of what I need to cover has been covered by my colleagues, but let me see how quickly I can run through my slides. Am I sharing? Can you see it? Okay, great. So, so Isabel Wilkerson breaks new grounds by demonstrating caste as a lens to understand the long-standing inequalities, subordination hierarchy that we witness in societies. So she gives a new name to the United States 400 years of racism. So instead of race, she posits caste as fundamental to understanding the long history of racism in the US. So I agree with Wilkerson when she says that caste is a belief system, a changing constellation of status, hierarchy, and relationship to work. So the beliefs and practices that constitute caste also constitutes the pillars that she discusses in a chapter that took deep roots in forms of ideology that took hold of the collective psyche of the people and enabled caste system to function. So now she makes an important analogy, which I find particularly useful, and that is she compares caste to the bone and the infrastructure to the race, and class to the clothing that we wear. So she then definitely adds an extra dimension to race by adding the category of class. So now in all this, and it's not unpredictably, India looms large in her picture. So any allusion to caste has to have conjures up the image of India. And she narrates the story from Manu Samhita, as Professor Fleming has pointed out. But through all her chapters, India constantly remains her principal referent. So what I want to emphasize, oh, sorry, I'm going to go to the slideshow. Bear with me, please. So what I want to emphasize with Wilkerson is that caste has a significance and a meaning which goes beyond India. It's not just India which has the caste system, but caste has its significance, and caste is a very, very meaningful concept in all of South and Southeast Asia. And this is the map that I wanted to show, that caste has a very strong niche in countries of Nepal, Bhutan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. So even in Pakistan, which is a predominantly Muslim country, or Sri Lanka, where Buddhism is a major religion, caste has an important role to play. More importantly, caste concepts and distinctions are also practiced among non-Hindus. So Christians, Muslims, Jains, Buddhists, and Sikhs in South Asia incorporate caste practices in their lives in very interesting and meaningful ways. So, so I want to engage with Wilkerson's kind of paradigmatic use of caste. So Wilkerson argues that racism is more than a division and hierarchy based on color. So caste for her is a much more powerful analytical tool than race, to demonstrate that it is more deep-rooted, more endemic, more fundamental than distinctions based on color. So she quotes Cuttrell and Diamond to posit that, like the Hindu caste system, the black-white distinction in the US has supplied a social hierarchy determined at birth and arguably immutable, even by achievement. Blacks became like the group of American untouchables, ritually separated from the rest of the population. So Wilkinson, in other words, attributes an immutability to caste. Using casteism in India as a constant and fixed referent kind of reduces the understanding of a vastly complex system that goes back to several millennia before the Common Era that Ben had pointed out. So with my focus on the British colonial period, which roughly spans between 1757 and 1947, I want to point out that caste took a different meaning and significance in the colonial period. So to understand caste historically, is to recognize that it has always been a changing reality. And here I'm really bringing in my historian's perspective. I tell my students to study history as a change over time. And so nothing showcases better change over time than caste does in the long annals of Indian history. So caste, as another leading historian of caste points out, it cannot be seen as a timeless or essential feature of the Indian subcontinent, but it rather needs to be understood in relation to political and social history. And caste, as Professor SenGupta pointed out, as we understand today, has been shaped through political, economic, and social processes, such as changing forms of kingship and labor, beginning in the 17th century through the British colonial policy and Indian independence movement. I will not have time to refer to the various caste movements that have taken place in the past several centuries in Indian history, but I will allude to some of the main currents. So also we need to understand that caste, as we understand today in the 21st century, what we study as scholars in the 21st century is not the same as it was in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. Neither is caste an identical category throughout India. It acquires different forms, meanings, histories in different places. Also, I agree with Wilkerson when she's pointing out to the numerous atrocities and discriminations that is perpetuated by the caste system. It has a continuing resonance, but we also have to be cognizant of the fact that in real life, there are exceptions to what she's stating. While some of the exclusions and inequalities that the untouchables face are insurmountable, for the bulk of the population, distinctions are much more fluid and flexible. So people of different castes work together, live as neighbors, become friends. So what I also want to point out is that Indian history now presents a long history of descent to caste practices. So to go back in time, both Jainism and Buddhism, the two religions that emerged in the course of 6th through 4th century BCE, both emerged as resistance movements to challenge the Brahmanical orthodoxy and the rigidity of the caste system. From the first millennium to the 6th, 17th century, India also witnessed a spate of bhakti movements or devotional movements, which were launched by women, outcasts, rebels, who later became very, very popular, even religious leaders. So some of these leaders are like Mirabai, who was a woman leader, Kabir, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and even Guru Nanak, who is the founder of Sikhism in India. So the descent is also an important aspect of this caste history. Coming down to the more contemporary period, in the colonial period and I'm referring to the 20th century, we have both Gandhi and Ambedkar and several other reformist groups who led stringent anti-caste movements. And B.R. Ambedkar is the preeminent leader of these modern caste movements, who Wilkerson refers to as a source. So B.R. Ambedkar, he was born into a very low caste, although I must note here, although he was belonged to a very low caste in Maharashtra, his father, however, worked for the army, and that gained him the privilege to send his sons to local schools. So although Ambedkar faced discriminations growing up, he succeeded in coming to Columbia University to earn his PhD in political science. From there, he moves to get a law degree from the London School of Economics. He then goes back to India and launched his anti-caste movements and founded a Dalit party, Dalit meaning oppressed, which is used to designate the lower caste, the untouchables in India, and which is still there, which is Bahujan Samaj Party, BSP. So Ambedkar, more importantly, became the first law minister of independent India, and he became the architect of the Indian Constitution. So as the principal author of the Indian Constitution, Ambedkar incorporated the legal status of the Dalits or untouchables in independent India. He wrote into law the reservation and the quota system, which is akin to what we have here, the affirmative action. So a fierce critique of the caste system, and he was also an opponent of Gandhi's policy on untouchables. At the end, B.R. Ambedkar converted to Buddhism along with his many followers. So the point I'm trying to make is that it's important to understand that colonialism, nationalism, and modern law affected workings of caste in India. The way we think about caste is also influenced by scholarly studies and intellectual trends and questions that we ask about it. So as a historian, and this is something we heard from our other panelists, it is important to scrutinize Wilkerson's use of sources. So for example, Wilkerson identifies divine will and the law of nature as the first pillar of caste. This is the quote that Professor Mancia pointed out at the very beginning, introducing her work. And she cites Manu Samhita, or the laws of Manu, that Professor Fleming reflected on. So what is important for us to understand is that Manu Samhita, which is an encyclopedic text of almost 3,000 verses, composed around the Common Era, beginning of the Common Era, slightly earlier, is something that was reinvented by the British. The British made the laws of Manu sources for colonial jurisprudence and legislation on a variety of topics, including marriage, divorce, legitimacy, adoption, inheritance, so on and so forth. So what it did was it flattened out the diversities among myriad sects and groups in Indian population. The British applied Hindu laws derived from Manu Samhita to 80% of the population in colonial India. And that colonial legacy still continues. Uh, in Again, I want to alert our listeners to the fourth pillar where Wilkerson compares the Dalits and the African Americans. Her source of reference here is W. Hunter, and it's very interesting to look at who W. Hunter was. He was a British colonial official. He was an administrator and historian who wrote about the lower castes in India. What was the context of his writing? He was writing the first ethnographic and field studies on castes that the British conducted to produce knowledge about the colonial population. So this is W. Hunter, and he was famously known for his Imperial Gazetteers of India, which first came out in 9 volumes in 1881, then ran into 14, and then into 26 volumes after his death. We can never escape the work. Anybody working in the colonial archives cannot escape W. Hunter. One of my students doing an independent studies here at Brooklyn College is now going through those tomes, and he's not here today, but he could vouch the importance of W. Hunter in compiling the statistics about Indian population, about gathering knowledge. And what I have put down here are his allusions and his very, very strong racist assumptions about the Indian population. I don't think I have time to read through those quotes. Interesting. That reveals his very racist biases. But again, where does this come from? W. Hunter was following the lines of James Mill, who wrote the history of India in 3 volumes. This James Mill, the famous utilitarian thinker and father of John Stuart Mill, who for the first time compiled the history of India, and where had the representation of Indians as degraded, barbaric, and uncivilized. So all the compilations that followed James Mill's work in 1816 had those kind of stamps that made stereotypes. So another major work is then the Tribes and Castes of Bengal, which is again a repository of all information about tribes and castes compiled by Herbert Hope Risley. Again, no scholar of the colonial times can escape these records. So Risley is one of those first British ethnographers who was in charge of the 1900 census of India. In that census, he formally applied the caste system to the entire Hindu population of British India. He was a principal advocate of scientific racism, and he used the ratio of the width of the nose to the height to divide Indians in Aryan and Dravidian races and into 7 castes. And then he was followed by Edgar Thurston and K. Rangachari, who produced Caste and Tribes of Southern India. And this is again, the main body of knowledge that Nicholas Turks examines in his Castes of Mind. So what I'm trying to say is, again, is caste is intimately tied to production of colonial knowledge and power. So by the time we scholars examine caste for academic interest, the contours and meanings of caste evolved to acquire a different meaning that encompassed colonial biases and knowledge. So thus, even when we examine caste, for academic purposes, it is heavily contingent on the context and many other complex factors. So caste demands a close look at local meanings and histories. So I just want to point out 2 misconceptions about caste: that caste determines occupations of all people in India, which is not true. Which is more important are the endogamous birth groups that called jatis, that Professor Fleming already pointed out. So what are jatis? Jatis means people belonging to a specific jati follow certain caste-based services that they inherit from the family. So some examples of caste groups are carpenters, potters, blacksmith, goldsmith, garland makers, salt merchants, hunters, tailors, drummers, press scribes, medical professionals, and we can keep on adding. Some families of service castes have hereditary rights to serve in these capacities, but there are no hard and fast rules that an individual would have to follow the profession of the family caste. And in most cases, what we have seen, we can give the examples of Gandhi. Gandhi's family belonged to the Baniya Jati, but all of his family members served the British administration as statesmen. So was Ambedkar's father, who served in the army. And people typically moved into more lucrative profession whenever it was available. And the second point, and that's something we already talked about, is caste is not a term that is used only in India. The term caste comes from casta, meaning color. And this is a word that we derived from the Portuguese, which was meant to designate the different categories of people under colonial government and their ranking relative to the nobility in the Americas. In Sanskrit, the term that was used was varna, also meaning color, which indicated the four categories, Brahmin, Kshatriyas, Vaishya, and Sudra, which do not encompass the whole range of jatis or these, birth groups that I mentioned. And then jatis are also not fixed. They're unique and specific to different regions and linguistic and religious communities. More importantly, jati was also used in colonial times by Indian writers to indicate race. That's another interesting dimension. So in conclusion, caste is always a work in progress. It's subtle, it's shifting, it's argued, and it's indefinite. So this is not because of movements, but of Hindu ideas of persons, which is fluid and changing, which partly was alluded by Professor Fleming. It's possible for entire castes to change their ranks and reputation by changing their nature. For example, M.N. Srinivas, a very important anthropologist who was actually one of the pioneering anthropologists who suggested to the process of Sanskritization or upward mobility of caste groups, by which lower social groups and castes gained upward mobility by emulating practices such as turning vegetarian, dressing in certain ways. In my work, I show how women withdrew from the workforce to raise their social status, emulating certain ritual life cycles. So there is always mobility and movement within caste groups. So while Wilkerson's caste provides an extra dimensionality to race, we have the responsibility to look at caste as a dynamic entity. So we have to avoid the pitfall of essentializing the very, very complex process and social phenomenon. So caste is concerned with power and rank. It's a mode of self-differentiation, a mode of action, a mode of understanding and misunderstanding. It's also a mode of caring as well. So caste, in its changing constellation of values, actions, ideas, and organizing principles, is a way of life. And caste is a product of complex histories that exist today in multiple forms. So in today's world in particular, caste works as a collective, as an index of collective identity, and it's a major basis for social organization. So new aspects of caste arose with the British colonial rule. So we have to take this complexity in mind instead of, and I'm a little nervous that the paradigmatic use of caste to explain the trope of caste can possibly run into the risk of stereotyping and essentializing a cultural and social characteristic in India, which is more complex, variegated, and context-specific that we should be attentive to. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Banerjee. I feel like Professor Banerjee's last sentence there could be like the motto for the history department, right? Like complicating and making more subtle historical topics since 30,000 BCE or whatever. I don't know how far back we go. Anyway, all right, we have 10 minutes now for some questions. I I am happy to take questions in the chat, or you can raise your little blue hand by pressing on the participants button and then pressing your little raise hand function. We have some questions from Chris Richter in the chat that are about the Nazi Germany connection. And as I was reading this book last night, I realized that we should have asked Professor Remy to talk too. That's my bad. So, you know, maybe part 2 can come in the spring, Chris. I don't know if any of us can talk about the Nazi Germany comparison. Professor SenGupta, do you want to go for it?
So, well, again, thanks, colleagues. Again, you emphasized, right, the importance of understanding the politics of producing historical sources, or the politics behind the production of historical sources. No, I just want to make the point that Stanley Elkins, how many of you are, I know that a couple of my grad students who are in the audience here are familiar with Stanley Elkins, but Slavery, a Problem in American Institutional and Intellectual Life. Are you familiar with that text? Any of you? So some of you are nodding, right? So do any of you want to talk about it? Do you want me to tell you what it was about? I see that some of you look as though you want to speak. Kabir, Salima, do you want to go? No? Okay. Stanley Elkins, right, highly controversial. He, in fact, his interpretation of the so-called Stambo stereotype became a point of departure for writing about debating enslaved personality types. And he was one of those who compared the process by which enslaved African Americans were dehumanized with the sort of socio-psychological dimensions of dehumanization in Nazi concentration camps. But then this became an incredible, essentially he was arguing that since the Sambo stereotype was so ubiquitous in slavery literature, there must have been something to this docile, infantile, happy-go-lucky stereotype. And he drew on the insights of role psychology, applied the insights of role psychology to both concentration camps as well as to the American plantation, which he said they're both total institutions. So the marginalized, subordinated victim is under constant surveillance by the master. And so because the master exercises life and death power over the victim, essentially the victim ends up playing the role that they're expected to play by the master. And in the process of playing this role over and over, they internalize the role. They become the role. And so and he made Elkins made essentially compared enslaved African Americans with victims of concentration camps who he said became dependent on some of their Nazi oppressors. But I have to say that it prompted such a huge uproar that much of the slavery scholarship from the 1970s was, and I'm talking about African American history here, was a reaction to this Elkins thesis. And the controversy went in many different directions, right? The comparison between slavery and concentration camps, it was argued, was not a good one. So I'll just.
Thank you, Professor SenGupta. Professor Troyansky.
Yeah, well, I want to thank my colleagues for their incredible erudition. And students may have noticed that sometimes if we're bringing our expertise to an object of study, we talk about our expertise and we may not get as much to the object of study as we'd like. So it means that if you want to answer these questions, you got to read the book. But there's a lot that they have to say that is related to the book, but it may not be obvious. I wanted to pick up on what Gunja was saying with the Stanley Elkins thing. It occurred to me that, you know, if the book works, it works as a way of taking something from these other historical examples and enlightening us about what Wilkerson calls the origins of our discontents, right? And so it's got to be about whether any of these comparisons work there. And one of my observations about this, as someone who does none of these fields, is that there's a kind of temporal issue where with the Nazi example, you're dealing with a 12-year period. And when you're dealing with the South Asian example, with all of the changes that Professor Banerjee has raised, you're dealing with a much longer period of time. And I wonder the extent to which that works. I mean, the other way the Nazi comparison works is if you're going to look at the African-American experience in the context of a kind of genocide, then that works. But I do wonder with these different sort of temporalities, how people feel about those comparisons.
Yeah,
Can
I certainly.
I say something? Okay, go ahead, Chris.
No, go ahead. You go. I talked enough. That's fine.
So Professor Troyansky, we meet again, and I'm going to disagree with you again. It may be, the culmination may be with the Nazis, but the Jews were the other for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years.
Sure.
And while their positions may have gone up and down based on the whims of the kings or other forces that were at play at the time, they were always very vulnerable to being destroyed, to being completely ejected. And yet they were also kept around a lot because they provided certain essential services that Christians were not permitted to engage in. So there is this, I think that you can go back way further than Nazism, but I think that it's certainly much more fluid than slavery. And because I still don't understand the ins and outs of the caste system, I cannot comment on it because it is so complicated and I just don't know enough about it. But I see that being a much longer playing situation than just the Nazi period.
Yeah. I agree. I'm just wondering about her use of it. So, yeah.
Okay. And I did say I was going to have to leave, and I'm sorry, but I had to stay to get that in. So thank you so much for this. This was wonderful.
Thank you. All right, I know that there are other things that are happening at the college in the Zoom space at 5:30. So I'm going to take one more question, and then I have put in the chat all of the places you can continue this conversation in spring 2021. There are lots of courses on Nazi Germany, on India, etc. Professor Banerjee.
I'll just jump in to address some of the questions, and the question that we all dealt with, whether this comparison works. I think it does. You know, she makes caste, race multidimensional by adding caste, by bringing in the notion of caste, because caste is not something that's endemic to India. It is pervasive. In any human society, we see the inequalities. All I urge our readers, because the common readers will not get it, is to add some qualifiers to her sources. And I hope in her extended edition or as a rejoinder or as an epilogue, she adds some context to the notion of caste that she's using. And my only problem is her use of the word immutability, her attribution of immutability to caste. Okay, that's it, Professor Mancia, thank you.
No, I mean, Professor Banerjee, I don't want to single her out, but her presentation was so great for students to understand how you can look at primary sources from different, I mean, all of you are doing this. Professor Stern had the Hebrew up on the screen, right? But we can really look at primary sources from all of their different contexts to understand how they were created. And that quote from Professor Stern about the interpreter being who our subject is more than the source we are interpreting is so fabulous. So there's a lot of like Cliff's notes for your papers, students, right here. Here it is for you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for coming. This is the last Passion event for the history department this semester. Stay tuned for more in the spring. This is not the last religion event this semester. Those of you who are interested in the question of race, on Thursday, December 3rd at 12:30, we are hosting Samir Yadav, who is going to talk about, his talk is called Not Even Past, Salvation History and the Philosophy of Race and Religion. So this is a good way, it's a good way to continue this conversation in a different context. If you want the Zoom link for that talk, email me. And thanks so much for coming.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
One more
Lauren.
applause for our
Thank you,
speaker.
Lauren.
Thank you.